Dawn came slowly in the suburbs. Alice stood at the window, watching the sun color the sky a soft pink. 25 years in the Marines had accustomed her to getting up before dawn. Christopher was still asleep. He had dry cleaning to do by 9, and there was no rush now. A year ago, she'd been out of the service for good. Her last tour in Afghanistan ended with a wound and a commissary. The scar on her neck still stung at night, but it hurt more when you couldn't see it. Psychologists called it post-traumatic stress disorder. Alice called it life. Christopher appeared in the kitchen, stretching sleepily. He came over, hugged her from behind, nuzzled his nose into the graying nape of her neck. In 27 years of marriage, they'd hardly seen each other. She'd gone away, come back, gone again. He waited. He'd grown his business. He'd started with one small dry cleaner. Now he had 3. He said it was all thanks to her support. Alice only shook her head. What support when she was always away? They drank coffee in silence. Alice loved those mornings. They could just sit next to each other, not trying to explain what couldn't be explained. Christopher understood without words. When panic struck, when the images of battle came into view, when she jumped up screaming in the night, he was there, held her hand until the trembling passed, didn't ask questions. At 52, starting life anew wasn't easy. Civilian clothes seemed uncomfortable, neighbors' smiles, false conversations, empty. Alice helped her husband with papers, fiddled in the garden, tried to learn to cook something more complicated than army porridge. She shuddered at loud noises, woke up at night checking the perimeter of the house, trying not to think about those left behind in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan. Christopher left for work, giving her a peck on the cheek. Alice watched his car and thought she was lucky. Many co-workers had returned to empty homes, wives unable to bear the long years of loneliness, children grown up as strangers, and she returned to the same loving gaze, the same caring hands. "Everything's going to be all right," Christopher said every night, cuddling her before bed. And she believed it, because more than anything, she feared losing this last island of peace in her wounded life. The morning air burned her lungs. Alice ran through the empty streets, measuring her usual route, past the park, along the canal, across the bridge and back. 5 miles, no more and no less. At this hour, the city was still asleep, with only the occasional garbage truck or patrol car passing by. The traffic light flashed yellow, reflecting in the puddles from the night's rain. When she got home, the first thing she did was check the perimeter, an old habit she couldn't shake. The gate was locked, the windows were closed, Christopher's car was in place. Everything's okay. It was safe to exhale. The coffee maker hissed quietly in the kitchen. Christopher fiddled with the stove, whistling to himself. It smelled like scrambled eggs and toasted bread. "How was your run?" He set a plate of breakfast in front of her. "Fine." Alice reached for her coffee. "Met a couple of the same early birds today. Runners. Why don't you meet them? You'll run together." Alice shook her head. Company during a run meant talking, asking questions, having to keep the conversation going. No, better alone. After breakfast, Christopher left to check the dry cleaners. Alice sat down at her laptop. Invoices, payroll. The numbers were soothing in their clarity. 2 + 2 is always 4, no surprises. In the afternoon, she drove to the 3rd dry cleaner, the most problematic. Small space in a shopping center, perpetual staff turnover, constant customer complaints. The new receptionist, a very young girl, was frightened at the sight of her superiors. "Documents for the week." Alice sat down at the counter. And the log of orders. The girl fussily pulled out folders. Her trembling fingers dropped papers tangled in the pages. Alice watched silently, the same one who skipped shifts and showed up with pink hair against all the rules. By evening, the sky had clouded over. She and Christopher sat in the gazebo, a new gazebo recently built for such evenings. Alice loved this time, when they could just sit side by side, listening to the silence of the garden and the rustling of the leaves. "Found the shortage?" She sipped the cooled tea. "At the 3rd location. Small, but systematic." "What are you going to do about it?" "I already did. Fired her. Tomorrow I'll transfer Jim from the 2nd dry cleaners. He's been asking for a long time." Christopher sighed. "You're too hard on them." "I'm fair." The first raindrops rattled on the roof of the gazebo. Alice shivered. The dampness always awoke phantom pain in old wounds, especially in the scar on her neck. She lay awake for a long time at night, listening to the sound of the downpour outside the window. Christopher murmured softly beside her. The newly planted roses in the garden were wet, dark red, almost black in the darkness. Alice stared up at the ceiling and thought that maybe she really should be nicer to people. After all, this is just a dry cleaner, not a military base. The rules are different here. In the morning, everything started over again. Jogging, perimeter check, coffee, numbers. The measured life dragged on like a vortex, and Alice let herself sink into it. Day after day, week after week. The middle of July was sweltering. The air conditioners in the dry cleaners were running low, and the staff complained of headaches. Alice checked each location twice a day, keeping an eye on the temperature and humidity. They couldn't let their customers' expensive clothes suffer from improper storage. At breakfast, Christopher looked thoughtful. He fiddled with his cup of cold coffee, frowning. "We need to hire an assistant," he finally said. "Someone to take over some of the administrative work. 3 outlets is a big business, and I can't do it alone." Alice shrugged. "I can spend more time on paperwork." "No, darling. You need to rest, to recover. Besides, you're great with the staff, that's more important." He said something else about the office he'd found, about deadlines and salary, but Alice wasn't listening. The pain was starting to throb in her temples, a sure sign of an impending panic attack. She concentrated on breathing, as the psychologist had taught her. Inhale and exhale slowly and deeply. Christopher noticed her condition, stopped talking, just put his hand on her shoulder. Warm, soothing. After a few minutes, the attack receded. "Do what you think is right," Alice said. "You're better at business." August brought new worries. One of the machines at the first dry cleaner broke down, an old one from when they first started. Alice spent 3 days looking for parts, fighting with suppliers and mechanics. At night, she dreamed of burning APCs and wrecked vehicles somewhere in the Afghan mountains. Christopher was now often late for work. He said that he was learning a new accounting system, and that his assistant was a good one. Alice nodded without going into details. She had her own worries accounts, statements, the eternal problems with the staff. In the mornings, she still ran the same way. 5 miles, no more and no less. The route didn't change. Past the park, along the canal, across the bridge and back. Occasionally, she would meet other runners. They would exchange brief nods and run on. No talking, no socializing. Roses bloomed in the garden, dark red, almost black at dusk. Alice spent evenings in the gazebo, listening to the cicadas chirping and the rustling of leaves. Christopher rarely kept her company now. A lot of work, new projects, business reorganization. September brought the first chill and new nightmares. Alice dreamed again of the last battle, the whistle of bullets, the screams of the wounded, the blood on her hands. She woke up in a cold sweat, panting. Christopher held her in his arms, whispered something, soothed her. In the morning, he left earlier than usual. Important meetings. He couldn't be late. At the Veterans Center, the psychologist increased the dose of antidepressants. The pills were still sent to the nightstand drawer, untouched, unnecessary. Alice could handle herself. She always did. Business was booming. The first dry cleaner was showing record turnover. The second one was picking up. Even the third one was doing well. Customers were coming back, bringing friends, leaving good reviews. Alice meticulously checked every order, monitored the quality of work, chased away negligent employees. Christopher rejoiced at her successes, praised her acumen. He said the business had blossomed when she took over. He made plans for the future. Maybe it was time to open a 4th location or buy a bigger house. Alice listened half-heartedly, nodding in the right places. She had enough to worry about with current affairs. October colored the leaves red and gold. Alice was pruning roses for winter, preparing the garden for the cold. It was getting colder and colder to run in the mornings, but she didn't change her usual route. 5 miles, no more and no less. Clarity and order were the only things that kept her going. Salma threw her leg over her foot, showing off her slender ankles. The short skirt rose even higher, and Christopher caught himself unable to look away. 22 years old, a fresh accounting degree, and an ambition that read in every movement. "You have an excellent resume, Miss Gitterly," he coughed, trying to return to a businesslike tone. "But not much experience for a position like this." "But I'm a fast learner." Salma leaned forward, her thin blouse straining against her chest. "And I'm willing to work overtime, as long as it takes." She smelled of something floral, a light, tantalizing scent. Christopher felt goosebumps run down his spine, a long, forgotten sensation, youth, desire, the promise of something forbidden. "All right." He slammed the folder of documents shut with determination. "Probationary period of 2 months. Then we'll see." Salma smiled, slowly, promisingly. She stood up, pulled up her skirt. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow. I'll show you the office." It was a small room on the second floor of a shopping center, in the middle between the dry cleaners. 2 desks, computers, coffee machine. Salma was looking around with a businesslike air, making notes in her notebook. "Would your wife mind?" she asked casually. "She's dealing with other things." Christopher averted his eyes. "Human resources, quality control. You're in charge of the paperwork." The days began anew. Salma was really capable. She quickly sorted out the paperwork, organized the databases, created new delivery schedules, and she was always willing to stay late. "Coffee, Mr. Johnson?" She entered his office as quietly as a cat. She'd bend over to set the cup down, and he'd smell her perfume, see the hollow between her breasts in the neckline of her blouse. "Thank you, Salma, and call me Christopher." She bit her lip, lowered her eyes. "Christopher." He came home late now. Alice didn't ask. She was used to his delays, busy with her own problems. Sometimes he found her in the garden, silent, aloof, surrounded by thorny roses. Sometimes she was asleep, or pretended to be. But in the office, Salma met him with a smile, brought coffee, casually touched his shoulder with her hand. Once she complained about the lack of money, student loans, rented apartment, sick mother. "Maybe you should think about a promotion." She looked pleadingly, biting her plump lower lip. "I'm trying, aren't I?" He gave her a bonus, then another one. Paid for a refresher course, bought a new laptop, for work, of course. She thanked him, warmly, sincerely. Her eyes glistened, her hands trembled. "You're so good to me, Christopher." He drowned in her gaze, in the smell of her perfume, in her soft smile. He forgot about home, about Alice, about his 54 years. Youth beckoned, stupefied, promised oblivion. In the evenings they often stayed together, to check reports, finish documents, prepare plans for tomorrow. Salma sat next to him, looking over his shoulder at the monitor, her hair tickling his cheek. "I'm so grateful to you," she whispered. "So grateful." That night she kissed him for the first time, lightly, almost innocently. And then she pulled away, lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." He pulled her back. To hell with it all, the years, the obligations, the ring on her finger. Youth was stupefying, driving him crazy, making him forget everything. Christopher got home at midnight. Alice was asleep, or pretending to be. The scars on her neck glistened in the darkness. He lay down beside her, trying not to make any noise. Salma's whispers still echoed in his head, the taste of her kisses burning on his lips. And in the morning, everything began again. Work, paperwork, meetings. Salma would greet him with a smile, bring him coffee, casually touch his shoulder with her hand. And her look promised more, much more than just a business relationship. The sun barely broke through the blinds of the office. Salma sat on the edge of her desk, tucking her leg over her foot. Her blouse was wrinkled, her hair disheveled, her lips swollen from kissing. Christopher stared at her as if mesmerized, young, beautiful, desirable. "Your lipstick's smeared." He reached out, wiping the red residue from her cheek. Salma reached for the mirror and wrinkled her nose. "All my makeup is ruined again, and you wrinkled my blouse." "We'll buy a new one." She smiled, that special smile that took his breath away. 2 months of their secret meetings, the hurried kisses in the back room, the quick sex on the office couch. He felt like a boy, in love, reckless, ready for anything. The phone vibrated. Alice. Salma immediately slid off the desk, retreated silently into the shadows. Christopher took a deep breath, accepting the call. "Darling." His wife's voice sounded muffled and cracked. "I'm leaving today for a reunion of my coworkers. For 3 days." "Good." He tried to speak smoothly, calmly. "Take care of yourself. I'll call you when I get there." Salma wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her breasts against his back. 3 days. Can you imagine how much time we'll have? He turned around, pulling her to him. She smelled of floral perfume and sex, a stupefying, maddening scent. "No more hiding in corners. We'll have dinner at the restaurant and then we'll go to my place. Are you sure your wife won't come back?" Salma licked his earlobe and goosebumps ran up and down his spine. "She won't. She never comes back from these meetings early." Alice methodically put her things into her gym bag, t-shirts, jeans, underwear, all in order, just like they taught her in the army. She stuffed her panic attack pills in a side pocket just in case. She hated large gatherings, but she couldn't miss the reunion. The highway stretched an endless gray ribbon. Roadside cafes, gas stations, billboards flashed outside the window. Alice turned on the radio, quiet, classical music, so as not to be distracted from the road. The panic attack came on suddenly. Her heart raced like crazy, her temples thumped, her eyes swam. She barely had time to pull over to the side of the road and turn off the engine. Inhale and exhale, slowly and deeply, like the psychologist taught her. It wasn't working. Panic came in a suffocating wave, just like when she'd been in the mountains, under fire. There was not enough air, her hands were shaking, cold sweat was pouring down her back. Alice gripped the steering wheel with white fingers. "We have to go back." She wouldn't make it. She couldn't. She couldn't drive in her condition, but at home there was peace and quiet, Christopher. He'll understand. He's always understood. The turn was clumsy, her hands still shaking. It took her twice as long to get back. She drove slowly, stopping constantly to catch her breath. The lights were on in the house. Muffled sounds came from the bedroom. Moans, the creaking of the bed, quiet laughter. A woman's laughter. She climbed the stairs, silently as she'd been taught. Years of training had not gone to waste. The door to the bedroom was ajar. She saw them at once. The young girl, almost naked, just lacy lingerie, straddled Christopher, head tilted back in ecstasy. His hands on her hips, her moans, their shared rhythm on their marital bed. The world narrowed to a single point. Alice looked as if through a scope, clear, sharp, unemotional. 25 years of training had taken its toll. "I'll give you a minute to get dressed and disappear." The voice sounded calm, almost mundane. The girl shrieked, rushing to the scattered clothes. Christopher turned white. "Alice, I can explain." "Get out," he said to the girl. She scurried out the door, tangling in her skirt. Christopher reached for his robe. Alice stepped forward. The first blow struck her in the solar plexus, clearly, professionally. The second was to the jaw. He sank to the floor, wheezing. She struck methodically without rage, just doing her job. His knuckles were bloody, but there was no pain. There was nothing. When she stopped, Christopher was no longer breathing. Alice looked at her hands, red, swollen. There was work to be done. There wasn't much time. Dressing the helpless body was harder than she thought. Alice proceeded methodically. Jeans, shirt, socks, boots. Like on a mission, precise, uncluttered. She wiped the blood from her face with wet wipes. The bruises were already showing, on her cheekbones, on her neck, on her chest. A surprisingly fragile human body. 27 years she'd woken up next to this body, and now it was just a load to be moved. The SUV was waiting outside the house, black, with tinted windows and a spacious trunk. 30 meters from the bedroom to the garage. Neighbors don't usually look out their windows at this hour, but you can't take any chances. One must calculate everything. The old plaid was in the trunk. Warm, plaid, smelling of grass and summer picnics. She spread it out neatly, smoothed out the folds. Checked the pulse on Christopher's neck. Nothing. His muscles were starting to stiffen. We'd have to hurry. It was a 4-hour drive to the canyon on an empty highway at night. She turned off her phone at once. She'd throw it away later and split it up. License and car papers in the inside pocket of her jacket. She wore gloves back at the house, thin leather gloves that didn't constrict her movements. Rare oncoming trucks whizzed past, blowing a stream of air. Headlights picked out road signs, roadblocks, and rare trees from the darkness. Alice kept exactly 90 kilometers per hour, not to attract attention. She didn't turn on the radio. She thought better in silence. Sleeping towns, gas stations with sleepy cashiers, roadside motels with flashing neon signs were passing by outside the window. The usual nighttime scenery. No one would pay attention to the lone car. No one will remember the woman behind the wheel. She didn't choose the canyon at random. Almost a kilometer deep, sheer walls of red sandstone, a raging river below. It's wild, not many tourists, even during the day. The body won't be found for a long time, if ever. And if they do, what could be more natural than suicide? Older man, family problems, depression, the usual story. Dawn found her at the observation deck. The first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls blood red. Fog swirled below, hiding the bottom of the canyon. Alice turned off the engine and got out to stretch her legs. The morning air smelled of wormwood and dust. The tourists would be here in 3 hours. She had plenty of time. Unloading the body was easier than loading it. Gravity helped. She put the plaid back in the trunk. She'd burn it with the other evidence later. She paused at the edge of the cliff, not out of sentimentality, just to assess the trajectory of the fall. The body disappeared silently into the fog, as if it had never been there. Alice stood for another minute, looking down. A gust of wind brought the smell of river water. Somewhere in the distance, a bird screamed. She left the car in the canyon parking lot, neatly between 2 pickup trucks with local license plates. I cut the gloves into small pieces and scattered them in the roadside bushes. The phone was disassembled, the parts thrown away in different places, at intervals of several kilometers. She walked home, army boots, well worn. You can walk for 24 hours without stopping. The sun was rising higher and higher. The air was filled with heat. Cars whizzed by, but she did not raise her hand. No witnesses. By evening, her legs were buzzing, but it was a familiar pain. It was the kind of pain one could live with. Dust covered her clothes, her hair, her face. Sweat ran down her back. She walked at a measured pace, not hurried, but not slow. At home, the first thing she did was shower. The hot water washed away the fatigue, the sweat, the last traces of the night's work. The bruises on her knuckles were beginning to darken. It would hurt tomorrow, but that was later. She sat down to write a missing persons report on her husband. The handwriting should be a little uneven, natural for an anxious wife. Didn't return from work. Phone unavailable, very worried. Standard phrases, standard situation. She'll file a police report in the morning. In the meantime, she can have a coffee, look at her garden. The roses have already bloomed, bare stems with thorns stretching to the gray autumn sky. Soon it will be winter. Everything dies in winter. The police station was so noisy it made my ears pop. The sergeant on duty, a young man with a neatly trimmed mustache, was scrutinizing the application. Alice sat opposite, clutching her purse. A worried wife, everything as it should be. "So you didn't return from work?" The sergeant looked up from his papers. "Yes, I was supposed to leave for a reunion, but I had a panic attack and came back. He wasn't home. Called all night, phones not available, standard questions, standard answers. No, it's never happened before. Yeah, he had family problems like everyone else. No, he didn't have any enemies, just a businessman with 3 dry cleaners in the city." By late afternoon, the search was well underway. Police were interviewing dry cleaners, checking security cameras, tracing calls. Alice answered calls from worried acquaintances, accepting condolences and promises of help. Salma showed up on the 3rd day. She rang the doorbell around noon, just as Alice was pruning roses in the garden. Young, beautiful, frightened, wearing the same skirt that had been lying on the bedroom floor that day. "Where's Christopher?" she asked on the doorstep. "What have you done with him?" Alice calmly put down the garden shears. "Come in, let's talk." The house was cool and quiet. Salma looked around nervously, clutching her purse in her hands. She sat down on the sofa carefully on the very edge. "I'll tell the police everything." Her voice shook. but her eyes were stubborn. About your threats? About what threats? Alice sat across from him, her hands on her knees. Her knuckles still ached. I just asked you to leave. You did. And then I talked to my husband. He didn't come home from work. I filed a missing persons report. All the paperwork's at the police station. You can check it out. Salma bit her lip, the one with the bright red lipstick. Pretty girl, young, the kind of girl who could get what she wanted. You killed him, she whispered. I know. Alice smiled, calmly, almost affectionately. Prove it. I'll go to the police. Go. Tell them how you slept with another man's husband for money and gifts, how you seduced an older married man, showing up at his house while his wife was away. Salma turned pale. Alice continued in the same even tone. And then think, if I really killed my husband, what's to stop me from killing my mistress? I've been in the service for so many years. I know how it's done. Are you threatening me? I'm not. I'm just talking. The girl jumped up, grabbed her purse. You're crazy. Maybe. Alice shrugged her shoulders. War trauma, panic attacks. It's all in the medical records. You should know. You were in accounting. You've seen the psychiatrist's bills. Salma strode toward the door. Alice gave her a look. Be good. Go home. Get another job. Forget this whole thing like a bad dream. The front door slammed. Alice went back to the garden. The roses still needed pruning. Winter was coming. She had to prepare them for the cold. In the evening, the police called. They had found Christopher's car at the canyon. She was crying into the phone. Properly. Convincingly. Yeah, I'll go identify it. Yeah, I'll be right there. It was going to be a long night. But she wasn't used to that. Sleepless nights were part of the job. Just like everything else. The canyon looked different in the daylight. The sun beat down on her eyes, reflecting off the red rocks. Two detectives stood outside Christopher's car, studying the tire tracks in the gravel. Alice wrapped her arms around herself. It was cold up here at the altitude. Mrs. Johnson, the older detective Ramirez, stepped closer. This is definitely his car? Yes, she nodded. The license plate, the scratch on the bumper, it's his SUV. The young partner was writing something down in a notebook. Alice looked down into the abyss. The fog had cleared, but the bottom was still invisible. The turbulent river seemed like a thin thread. This is a strange place, Ramirez muttered. It's a 3-hour drive to the nearest town. What was he doing here? I don't know. Alice shook her head. He liked nature. Sometimes he went to take pictures. But he usually warned me. The police diver down by the river waved his hand. Nothing. 4th day of the search and still no body. Ramirez frowned. Something wasn't adding up. Did you find a camera in the car? No. The young detective checked his notes. Just a blanket in the trunk and documents in the glove compartment. Alice looked at the horizon. There, beyond the ridge of rocks, the reserve began. Hundreds of square kilometers of wilderness. Look for it. At the same time, at the police station, Sergeant Morrison was poring over papers. It had been a quiet day, a couple of petty thefts, a family scandal, a missing cat report. There was a knock on the door. Salma didn't look well, pale, with circles under her eyes. She sat down in her chair, nervously fiddling with the strap of her purse. I'm here about Christopher Johnson's disappearance. Morrison pushed his notebook over to him. I worked for him, as a secretary. We're lovers? The sergeant raised an eyebrow. Salma flared up. Where are you from? Honey, it's a small town. Things like this don't stay secret. She rambled on, about the affair, about the money and gifts, about the night her wife returned. Morrison took notes, nodding occasionally. And then what? She told me to leave, so I left, and the next day, Christopher was gone. And you think, she killed him? Salma stepped forward. You should have seen her eyes, like a robot's. She's military, she knows how to kill. Morrison leaned back in his chair. So you slept with her husband, she caught you and politely asked you to leave? Yes, but she didn't beat you up. She didn't make a scene, she just told you to leave. You don't understand. Salma jumped up. She would have killed me too, if... Sit down, the sergeant sighed. Okay, here's the deal. We have the facts. You were having an affair with a married man. His wife caught you. Instead of a scandal, she just kicked you out the door. Husband's missing. Car was found at the canyon. Where's the crime in that? But she's a veteran with PTSD, yes, under medical care. Paperwork's in order. Alibi's solid. Neighbors saw her driving to file a report this morning. No sign of a struggle in the house. What do you want us to look for? Salma was silent. Morrison continued more gently. Take my advice. Forget the whole thing. Get a job away from here. These stories don't end well. When she left, the sergeant put the application in the non-urgent pile. An hour later, going through the paperwork, he didn't even remember it. At the canyon, meanwhile, the search was winding down. Divers surveyed 5 kilometers of the river, to no avail. Ramirez smoked, looking at the sunset. What do you think? He asked his partner. It looks like suicide. He shrugged. Or an accident. The place is wild. The rocks are slippery. Could have slipped while taking a picture. Where's the camera? Could have fallen into the river. Or it wasn't there at all. Alice sat in the police car, waiting for the detectives to return. The sun was setting behind the mountains, coloring the sky bloody. It would be dark soon. The sounds are different here at night. The wind in the rocks, the cries of night birds, the sound of the river below. Mrs. Johnson, Ramirez opened the door. We're done for the day. Shall we take you home? She nodded. The car started down the dusty road. In the rearview mirror, the canyon grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. At home, the first thing Alice did was go to the garden. The roses were waiting, prickly, ruthless, like life itself. The garden shears were a familiar weight in her hand. Work, only work. Nothing else mattered. The body was found by a fisherman 40 kilometers downstream. Old Jim Harper checked the nets every morning, but he didn't expect such a catch. At first, he mistook it for driftwood. The current often brought tree trunks to the shore, but when he got closer, Ramirez arrived an hour after the call. The body was stuck between the rocks, mangled, swollen from the water. The detective watched morgue workers load a black plastic bag into a van. The morning sun beat down on his eyes, seagulls screeching in the distance. The morgue smelled of formalin and death. Dr. Chen worked methodically, cut by cut, layer by layer. A small tape recorder on the table captured every detail. Ramirez looked through the glass, lighting one cigarette from another. Interesting picture. Chen pulled off his bloody gloves. Very interesting. What is? The injuries. Their pattern and sequence. Look. The pathologist led the detective to a screen with x-rays. These are the injuries sustained post-mortem. Multiple rib fractures, limb fractures, head trauma. Typical of a fall from a great height. And the others? Well, the rest of the injuries are pre-mortem. And that's the interesting part. Chen pointed to the chest x-ray. See the pattern of hemorrhaging? A clear, directed blow to the solar plexus. It's the kind of thing that trained people know where to hit. Ramirez leaned over the scans. Keep going. The jaw fracture is also antemortem, and again, a precise blow measured. But most importantly, the neck. The pathologist displayed another image on the screen. Fracture of the hyoid bone, cartilage damage, classic pattern, So he was killed before he was dumped, and it was done by a professional. Not a single extra blow, precise and methodical. I'd say military training. Ramirez looked thoughtfully at the pictures. How can you be so sure? 30 years in the profession, detective. I've seen all kinds of murders, drunken brawls, domestic disputes, gang warfare. It's different. Random blows, accidental injuries. This is the work of a professional. 4 blows and the man is dead. Then the body was thrown from a height to make it look like an accident. Or a suicide. Exactly. But the water and the rocks did their job, washed away some traces but showed others. An hour later, Ramirez was in Salma's office. Small room above a hardware store, computer desk, coffee machine in the corner. Smelled like cheap air freshener and fear. Miss Gitterly, I need to ask you a few questions. Salma jumped up, pale, with circles under her eyes. I told you. I've been to the police. I've made a statement. It was her, his wife. What statement? Sergeant Morrison. I told him everything. About our affair with Christopher, about how she caught us. Ramirez felt the rage boiling up inside him. 20 minutes later, he was at the station. Morrison met him pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. Where's Gitterly's statement? It's in here somewhere. Ramirez watched the sergeant rummage through the papers. It was at the bottom of the non-urgent pile, crumpled, coffee-stained. Are you a fucking idiot? Ramirez could barely contain himself. We had a statement from the victim's mistress, and you fucked it up? But there's nothing to it. It's just a story about a wife catching her husband with her mistress, and just asked her to leave? Didn't make a scene? Didn't throw punches? Didn't that strike you as odd? Morrison didn't say anything. Ramirez read Salma's testimony, and the picture was emerging, slowly but inexorably. Military training, clear, precise blows, coolness instead of jealousy. Prepare your report. He tossed the papers on the table. Explain why you ignored the application, and pray you're just demoted, not kicked the hell out. It was getting evening. The only light in the office was the desk lamp. Ramirez looked at the photos of the body, at the pathologist's report, at Salma's testimony, mentally organized the chain of events. Marine veteran, 25 years of service, combat training, psychological trauma. Husband has a young mistress. Wife catches them, doesn't scandalize, just asks the girl to leave. And then, a call from an expert interrupted his musings. Detective? We found something interesting in the victim's car. There's traces of blood on the plaid in the trunk. Almost imperceptible, but it's there. Ramirez wrote down the details. It's going to be a tough conversation with Mrs. Johnson tomorrow, but it can wait till morning. Nighttime is a bad time for such conversations. Ramirez arrived at dawn. The first rays of the sun were barely breaking through the clouds, and the air was dank and damp. In such weather, old wounds ache more. Alice was in the garden. She always got up early, a military habit ingrained in her blood from 25 years of service. The measured clatter of a shovel against the ground, the smell of damp soil. Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. She didn't even flinch. She must have heard his footsteps as he approached. She straightened slowly, pulled off her work gloves. Detective, did you find something? Yes. Ramirez looked at her hands, strong, calloused from work. Hands like that could grow flowers or kill a man. Your husband's body. Alice nodded without surprise, without fear. Where? 40 kilometers downstream from the canyon. Would you mind coming with me? 10 minutes. She folded her tools neatly. Let me get changed. The car was silent. Ramirez watched her furtively in the rearview mirror, her back straight, her gaze forward, her hands resting calmly in her lap, not a shadow of concern. The precinct greeted them with the usual bustle. Calls, voices, rustling papers. Someone carried a cup of coffee past. A fax machine rattled in the far corner. Alice walked through this chaos with a measured stride, as if on parade. The interrogation room was small and cold. Gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs. A clock on the wall ticked methodically, inexorably. Ramirez spread a thin folder of documents on the table. Tell me again what happened that night. Alice looked over his shoulder as if she saw something interesting. I already told you. I was going to a meeting of co-workers. Had a panic attack on the way. I came home, caught her husband with his mistress. And you just asked the girl to leave? Yeah. You didn't get angry? You didn't make a scene? Ramirez stepped forward. 27 years of marriage, and you just stand there and watch a young girl fuck your husband in your bed? Why? She shrugged. That would be unprofessional. He leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing her face. Calm, without a single emotion. You know what's interesting? Salma Gitterly left you alive twice. The first time was from the bedroom. The second time was when she came to threaten you. Why? Alice looked him in the eye for the first time, straight, lifeless. Because she wasn't the target. Superfluous victims create superfluous problems. A chill ran down the detective's back. There was nothing in those eyes. No remorse, no fear, no anger. Just emptiness and calculation. You killed him. Prove it. Already proved it. Ramirez began laying the photographs on the table. Traces of blood on the plaid in the trunk. Pattern of injuries. Typical Marine MO Salma's testimony. Your military background. So what's next? You beat your husband to death in cold blood. Drove the body to the canyon. Dumped it to make it look like a suicide. It was starting to rain outside the window. The drops drummed on the glass. like machine gun fire somewhere in the Afghan mountains. "Why didn't you run away?" Ramirez asked. "There was time." "Where to?" She shrugged again. "This is my home." The courtroom was stuffy. The jury had been deliberating for less than an hour, a record for murder cases. Alice stood at attention as the verdict was read. Life in prison without parole. Ramirez saw her for the last time as they led her out of the courtroom. She walked with a steady stride, clear, measured. The guards did not hold her under her arms. She knew where to go. That night he sat at the bar for a long time, staring into his glass. Her face stood before his eyes, calm, detached. And her eyes, empty, as if looking through the scope of a sniper rifle. His partner sat down beside him, ordered a whiskey. "What are you thinking about?" "About the war," Ramirez twirled the glass. "About the fact that it never ends. It just changes fronts." It was raining outside the window. Somewhere in an abandoned garden, untended flowers were dying.